Okay, hello to all of you. Let's discuss chapter number 2, part 2. So basically, we have talked about the periodic table. We have talked about the we have talked about the structure of the atom. We have talked about what is in the nucleus, what is in the energy shells, and how the electrons are distributed, and what is the octet rule. We have seen the periodic table. So now, as we talked in the last lecture, in the last part of the chapter number 2, we talked about that there are some atoms in which the outermost shells are completely filled, and some of the atoms, the outermost shells are not completely filled. If the outermost shell, which is a valence shell, is not completely filled, then the atom is unstable. And if the outermost shell is completely filled, then the atom is stable. And if the atom is stable, then these atoms do not react. They are inert elements. And the atoms whose valence shells are incompletely filled, the ones which are incompletely filled, they are the reactive elements. So they need to react with other atoms. And why they need to react? So that they can attain stability. So the aim is to completely fill the outermost energy shell. So that's the aim. So for attaining stability, these atoms, they fall into different kinds of arrangements, and that's what we call them as bonding or chemical bonding. So this chemical bonding can be there are different kinds of bonds which we are going to discuss. They're covalent bonds, ionic bond, hydrogen bonds. So that's what we are going to talk about. So atoms with incomplete valence shells can share or transfer valence electrons with certain other atoms. And when they share the electrons, or when they lose or gain the electrons, that results in the formation of bond between the atoms, and these bonds are called chemical bonds. So a covalent bond is formed by the sharing of electrons between two atoms. Now, how many electrons do the atoms share? On the basis of that, so that results in the formation of single bonds or double bonds. So covalent bonds are formed by the sharing of the electrons. Okay, so now you can see the example of two hydrogen atoms. So we know that in each hydrogen atom, there is one electron in the first energy shell. So each atom needs one more electron so that they can be stable. So what do these atoms do? They come close to each other and they share the single electron which each atom has in its outermost shell. So you can see that these two atoms are coming close to each other. These two atoms are coming close to each other and they're sharing the electron cloud with each other. So this atom has one electron, this atom also has one electron. So they share the electron cloud. That results in the formation of a covalent bond between these two hydrogen atoms. So if the two atoms they share a single pair of electron, that results in the formation of a single bond. If the two atoms they share two pair of electrons, that results in the formation of a double bond. So you can see here, this is hydrogen. These are two hydrogen atoms. And they share the electrons with each other, and that results in the formation of a single bond between them. Similarly, the case of oxygen. Oxygen has atomic number is 8, so 2 and 6. So they have 6 electrons in the outermost shell. So they have 6 electrons in the outermost shell, and so each needs 2 more. So they share. So this one will share 2 electrons with this, and this one will share 2 electrons with this, and that results in the formation of a double bond. That results in the formation of a double bond between these two oxygen atoms. So similarly here, water. So water has one oxygen and two hydrogens. So oxygen needs how many electrons? 2 electrons. And each hydrogen needs 1 electron. So this hydrogen shares 1 electron with this oxygen, and this hydrogen shares 1 electron with this oxygen. So that results in the formation of a single bond here and a single bond here. So this is the way water is. And for methane, methane has 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens. So every carbon has 6 electrons. So these 6 electrons are distributed as 2 and 4. So there are 4 electrons in the outermost shell. So carbon needs 4 more electrons, and that 4 electrons, it gets from 4 hydrogen atoms. So this is carbon, these are 4 hydrogen atoms. So that results in the formation of one single bond between carbon and hydrogen, carbon and hydrogen, carbon and hydrogen, and carbon and hydrogen. So that's the way how covalent bonds are formed. Another important thing to know about here is the concept of electronegativity. Now, what is electronegativity? Electronegativity is electronegativity is basically an ability of an atom to pull the electrons towards itself. Okay, so electronegativity is an atom's attraction for the electrons in a covalent bond. Electronegativity is an atom's attraction for electrons in a covalent bond. So the more the atom is electronegative, more it has a tendency to pull the shared pair of electrons towards itself. Now let's talk about and because of the difference of electronegativities, it results in the formation of polar covalent bonds. So I will explain you in detail. So if the two atoms which are sharing electrons, so let's go back here and you can see some examples here. Now this is 2 hydrogens. These are 2 hydrogens and they're sharing electrons with each other. These are 2 oxygens, they're sharing electrons with each other. So the partners which are forming the bonds, they're same here. Okay, so if the 2 hydrogens are involved, they have same electronegativity. So it means that if the 2 partners are same, they have same electronegativity, which means that they have the same ability or tendency to pull the electrons towards itself. So which means that these bonds which are formed between between 2 hydrogens, they are the non-polar covalent bonds. If the bond is formed between now 2 oxygens, again the 2 partners are same. So these bonds are also non-polar covalent bonds because the partners are same. So they are going to pull the electrons equally. So the sharing of electrons between 2 oxygens or 2 hydrogens here is going to be equal because the partners are same. If you talk about water, in the case of water, if you see this is oxygen, these are 2 hydrogens. So oxygen, which is more electronegative as compared to hydrogen, and why it's more electronegative as compared to hydrogen? Because in the nucleus of oxygen, there are 8 protons. So the nucleus of oxygen is more positively charged as compared to hydrogen. Hydrogen has only one proton. So oxygen has 8 protons, hydrogen has only 1 proton. So oxygen has more tendency of pulling the electrons towards itself as compared to hydrogen. So in the case of water, the electronegativity of the two atoms is different. So in this case, what happens is this oxygen has more tendency. So this oxygen and hydrogen, you can see they are sharing 2 electrons between each other. So this is oxygen, this is hydrogen. They're sharing one pair of electron, which is 2 electrons between each other. But because oxygen is more electronegative, it has a tendency, because it's more electronegative, it has a tendency of pulling the electrons, it has a tendency of pulling the shared electrons towards itself. And as a result of that, what happens is, because these shared electrons move towards oxygen, These shared electrons, they move towards oxygen. This oxygen gets slight negative charge and hydrogen gets slight positive charge because the electron cloud moves away from hydrogen and goes towards oxygen. So as a result of that, oxygen gets slight negative charge and hydrogen gets slight positive charge. That results in the formation of polar covalent bonds. So this is what is explained here. What are non-polar covalent bonds and what are the polar covalent bonds. So this is the case of water. So in the water you can see oxygen has slight negative charge and hydrogen has slight positive charge. And as a result of that, the electrons are moved more towards the oxygen. Oxygen gets slight negative charge, hydrogen has slight positive charge. And that results in the formation of polar covalent bonds between oxygen and hydrogen. So there are two polar covalent bonds between oxygens and hydrogens in water. So one bond is here, second bond is here, and they are polar covalent bonds. Okay, now we're going to talk about ionic bonds. So what happens? So covalent bonds are formed by sharing of electrons. Ionic bonds are formed by the losing and gaining of electrons. So one of the atom loses electrons and the other atom gains electrons. So as a result of that, when one atom loses electrons, it gets positive charge, and when one atom gains electron, it gets negative charge. So one atom has negative charge, another atom has positive charge, and they are no more neutral atoms. Then they are no more neutral atoms. So then they become ions. So the bond which is formed between the positively charged and negatively charged ions is called the ionic bond. So you can see here, this is an example of sodium chloride here. Now sodium has 11 electrons. So how they distributed? 2 electrons go in the first energy shell and then 8 electrons go in the second energy shell. And the third energy shell has the 11th electron. And chlorine on the other side has 17 electrons. So 2 in the first one, 8 in the second one, and the 7 electrons in the third energy shell. So for sodium, because sodium has 11 electrons, so 2, 8 and 1, and chlorine has 17 electrons, so 2, 8 and 7. So sodium 2, 8 and 1. So this electron is problem for sodium because this is the one which is making it unstable. And chlorine has 2, 8 and 7. So it needs one more electron so that it can have one more electron in the outermost shell, and it becomes completely the last shell becomes completely filled. So basically sodium and chlorine, they decide sodium will lose this electron and chlorine will gain this electron. So when sodium loses this electron and chlorine gains this electron, sodium gets how many electrons? 10 electrons. And chlorine gets how many electrons? 18 electrons. So this way both become stable. But one thing happens, when sodium loses one electron, it gets positive charge because sodium's nucleus still has 11 protons. And what about chlorine? So when chlorine gains one electron, the sodium's electrons, now it has 18 electrons. But the number of protons which are there in the nucleus of chlorine, they are 17. So 17 protons in the nucleus and it has 18 electrons. So chlorine gets negative charge. So this process of losing and gaining electrons makes these atoms no more neutral. They become ions. So sodium becomes positively charged ion and chlorine becomes negatively charged ion. So the bond which is formed between these oppositely charged ions is called a ionic bond. And positively charged ions are called cations and negatively charged ions are called anions. So sodium chloride is a typical example of a ionic bond. Okay, other than these covalent and ionic bonds are strong bonds, and out of these bonds, covalent bonds are the strongest bonds. So now we're going to talk about some of the bonds which are weak bonds. The first example is of a hydrogen bond. Now hydrogen bond is a bond which is formed in one of the So the hydrogen bond is formed between two atoms, and one of the atom is hydrogen because the name itself says hydrogen. So hydrogen bonds are formed when hydrogen atom, which is itself covalently linked. It's formed when a hydrogen atom, which is itself covalently bonded to one electronegative atom, is also attracted to another electronegative atom. So you can see here, this is water. This is water, and the oxygen has slight negative charge and hydrogen has slight positive charge. So this is water. This is water, and oxygen has slight negative charge and hydrogen has slight positive charge. So this water, when it interacts with ammonia, so in ammonia, which is NH3, which has one nitrogen and three hydrogens, so it has one nitrogen and three hydrogens. So nitrogen has slight negative charge and hydrogens have slight positive charge. So this hydrogen of water, it is itself covalently linked with oxygen, but it also gets attracted towards the nitrogen of this ammonia. But this attraction is very transient, it's very weak, and this results in the formation of a very weak bond, and that bond is called the hydrogen bond. So van der Waals interactions. So van der Waals interactions are the interactions which are formed between the atoms because of the unequal distribution of electrons. So when there is unequal distribution of the electrons, so the side of the atom which has accumulation of more electrons become negatively charged, and the side which has less electrons become positively charged. And when these atoms, which have the unequal distribution of electrons, they come close to each other, they get attracted towards each other, and these are called van der Waals interactions, and these are weak interactions. Okay, basically, like you must have seen a lizard and all these insects climbing the walls, and they just climb by the van der Waals interactions. Now the last topic we are going to talk about is the shape of the molecule and its function. So the shape of the molecule and the function are very related. So a molecule's shape and its functions are very much related, and molecules so what the shape of the molecule is, it determines the function of the molecule. So molecule's shape is determined by the position of its atoms orbitals, and these in the covalent bonds, s and p orbitals, they hybridize and they create the specific molecular shape. So basically, what kind of a shape a molecule has, what kind of a shape a molecule has, it all depends on the shape, how these hybrid orbitals, they basically are bonding with each other. So you can see here, this is water, and the water has basically the oxygen in the water, and these are the hybrid orbitals of the these are the hybrid orbitals of the oxygen, and these hybrid orbitals, then they bond with the hydrogen, and then the water gets this kind of a V shape. And methane, in the case of methane, these are the hybrid orbitals of the carbon, and then how they form bonds with the s orbital, because hydrogen has only one s orbital. So how they form the bond with the 1s orbital of the hydrogen, and that's the way when they bond, they form the methane gets the shape of a tetrahedron. So as I said, the shape of the molecule determines the function of the molecule. So basically, here's one very typical example that so when we are in pain, in our brain, there are some neuropeptides secreted, and they go and bind on some of the receptors in the brain, and they're called natural endorphins. So they go and bind on the receptors, and they basically relieve the pain. So morphine, which is a drug, which is also a painkiller, morphine, which is a drug, which is a painkiller, it also does the same thing. It also goes and binds on the same receptors in the brain, and relieves the pain. So how morphine can go and sit on these receptors and relieve the pain? It is because the morphine and these natural endorphins, they have the same structure. So the molecules which have same structure, they can perform the same function. So here basically it talks about a very important function, a very important relationship between shape and function. So that's all about chapter number 2. So let me know if you have any